Hello, this is part C for week 12. Here we're really describing agreement making in our current system. A little bit of an overview, some key points to know. Agreements have to be voted on before they're registered and legally enforceable, and that's a simple majority of employees who vote, 50 plus 1, have to vote yes. There's no protected industrial action allowed once an agreement's been approved. If the majority of employees want a collective agreement, the Fair Work Commission can order employers to bargain in good faith. They can't force an employer to reach agreement if a proposed agreement, what's looking likely, really looks to be unsustainable for the business. The employer can still say no, but they have to have had listened to bargaining representatives. The Fair Work Commission can be asked to assist the parties to help reach agreement on specific matters, but really it's a bargaining system. There's a limited role for the Commission here. Agreements will only be registered and legally enforceable if the Commission's agreed that they've met the better off overall test. So workers can't be worse off under an enterprise agreement than they would be their relevant modern award. Maximum duration of 4 years for an agreement. One thing to note though about this idea of a maximum term, expiry dates and durations are really nominal rather than real. Agreements live on unless one of the parties applies to the Commission to have it terminated. Otherwise, it can continue on in life until it's replaced by a newly negotiated agreement. In practice, parties usually start bargaining before the current agreement has expired, but it's sensible to do that, maybe 3 months out, 6 months out, but industrial action isn't allowed until that nominal expiry date has passed. Protected industrial action. It's allowed during the bargaining period. A secret ballot is required of union members. Only union members can take industrial action. So secret ballots required, and there's still a lot of complex procedural steps for a union to go to before they're allowed to take industrial action. Employers have quite restricted opportunities for industrial action under the current Fair Work Act. Unlike unions, the employers can't initiate industrial action. The employer can only engage in a lockout if unions have taken industrial action first, so they can only do it in retaliation. The Fair Work Commission can make orders to suspend or prevent industrial action from occurring, and in such cases they'll encourage the parties back to the negotiating table, but they might also end up arbitrating themselves to resolve the impasse in bargaining. Andrew Stewart's given some consideration as to what benefits there might be to the parties from engaging with the Fair Work Commission and the registration process for having a registered collective agreement. As opposed to having an informal agreement, unregistered common law agreement, there are some benefits to be had. The registered collective agreement can allow changes to be made to terms and conditions of employment away from the award. So whilst workers can't be made worse off than the safety net, you can make alterations to terms and conditions of work that are quite different from what would happen under the award provisions. Also, a second reason is the workers and unions might be putting pressure on the employer to provide for pay increases, and we have to realise most enterprise agreement making is workers want a pay increase. They'll approach their employer for the wage increase above what's provided through awards and the annual wage review. And it's sensible for the employer then to get a commitment, a legally enforceable commitment to particular provisions that they want in an enterprise agreement, things that perhaps boost the flexibility of the business, for example. Once an employer has reached agreement and employees have voted and the agreement's live, that means that there's no threat of industrial action for the life of that agreement. And for some organisations, businesses, number 4 here, it's easier to administer one enterprise agreement rather than, say, a whole series of common law agreements or or provisions where the legal status is questionable. Sensible to have everything written into one legally enforceable document. Now, the provisions, we can have single enterprise agreements, and that's the normal approach to have, enterprise by enterprise. Now, that being said, you can have more than one agreement for an enterprise. For example, you might have one agreement for maintenance workers and then another for manufacturing workers. In the airline industry, it's quite common to see separate agreements for the ground crew versus flight crew versus the pilots, for example. There are provisions for multi-enterprise agreements. We don't need to get into too much detail there, but it's really just trying to be open to the different kinds of business structures that exist these days. Now, this is important, the making of an enterprise agreement. Hopefully you did your own online research and tutorials for this. The first step is that the employer must notify individual employees about who will be covered by a proposed agreement and inform them of their right to a bargaining representative. So that kickstarts the whole process. Once that happens, then bargaining takes place. It's for an unspecified period of time, no less than 21 days. But for some non-union small business bargaining, it might be possible that the employer has a pretty good idea of what they want, and they might have an agreement pretty much drafted, and the amount of negotiation might be quite limited. The employee representatives might agree pretty much to what the employer has drafted and has ready to go, in exchange for perhaps a small pay rise. So bargaining can be very, very fast, but it can also be really drawn out. I'm afraid to say in the university sector, some bargaining periods have lasted more than 2 years, including here at Western Sydney. Hopefully we'll get better at it. Anyway, so no sooner than 21 days, but often for a much longer period than that. If there's a proposed agreement that the bargaining representatives have agreed on, the employer can no sooner than 21 days after the notification of bargaining representatives, but normally much, much later than that, the employer can submit the agreement to employees for their voting approval. Now, often that proposed agreement that's put to employees has been agreed with the bargaining representatives, but not always. Sometimes an employer might feel that the bargaining is taking too long, that the bargaining representatives for employees or for the union are being too difficult, and they think that they've got a pretty good deal on offer. They might decide to bypass the bargaining representatives and put that enterprise agreement directly to workers for workers to vote on as individuals. That's not going to happen that often because, individual employees might think, well, actually I agree with our bargaining representatives, or, they might be hearing from their own bargaining representative that actually the employer's being unreasonable, there is a better deal to be had. Let's go for, say, industrial action before we agree. But then the employer might be saying to individual employees, we've gone through this bargaining process, this is the best possible deal that we can offer, and test the waters, see if employees will vote it up. So there can be some tactics around that. So, the employer has to ensure that employees have access to the agreement at least 7 days before they have to vote on it, that's so they can get advice and be fully informed. The employer has to be really clear with employees about when and how the vote will be taken. It might be like an online voting process or a pen and paper process, and how will that work. The employer also has an obligation to make a reasonable effort to explain the implications of the agreement to affected employees. How does it differ from our current agreement? How does it differ from the award? Am I really going to be better off? The employer has to provide that explanation. The agreement will only be made if a majority of employees who vote yes. If a whole group of employees choose not to vote, that's really up to them. As long as the employers inform them that they've got rights to vote, that here's the agreement, this is the implication. If they choose not to vote, that's fine. But of those who do vote, 50 plus 1% is have to vote yes to accept the agreement. Then we get to the procedures with the Fair Work Commission. The Fair Work Commission has to ensure agreements are being genuinely agreed. They check that the agreement doesn't have any unlawful terms or objectionable terms. You can't, for example, write a clause in an enterprise agreement that contradicts the Fair Work Act, for example, or is inconsistent with the National Employment Standards. They also undertake the Better Off Overall test. They check to see that each individual employee, technically is better off than they would be under the award. In practice, they tend to consider groups of workers who work certain patterns. For example, the enterprise agreement might make some changes to penalty rates for weekend work, penalty rates for night shifts, for example. The Commission will have to sort of think through, well, if that group of employees has a reduced penalty rate for weekends but an increased penalty rate for night shifts, and how are they better off? And compare them perhaps to a group of employees who just work Monday 9 to 5. Are they better off? So they tend to work sort of groups by groups. Sometimes the Commission will ask an employer to provide undertakings around how some of the clauses will operate in practice. How many workers are working night shift, or how many nights of the year would be on night shift with this particular level of penalty rate, as opposed to the number of workers who perhaps work on weekends. They might also give consideration to permanent and casual workers as well. They will. And they might ask for undertakings from the employer that, in these circumstances, I don't think workers will be better off. The employer on the spot can give an undertaking to improve the agreement in some way, or to put in some sort of workaround to make sure that workers won't be worse off. You're more likely to see undertakings in non-union agreements, and this is because those workers tend to be lower paid, particularly of hospitality, retail, small businesses. Then it can be, if the wage rates are really quite close to the award rate, it can be very difficult for the Commissioner to see some evidence that workers will be better off. Sometimes the Commission can approve agreements that leave workers worse off than the award, but that's only in really restricted circumstances, and only if there's a public interest test there. The Commission doesn't actually investigate whether the bargaining process was conducted in good faith or not. They really engage in good faith bargaining only, when one party raises an issue and approaches them. They don't, consider that. They just look at the written agreement in the end. And if employees have voted yes to it, then they're looking to see how they can approve that agreement, making sure it doesn't fall short of provisions in the Fair Work Act. There doesn't always have to be a hearing where the parties come in and talk to the Commissioner. It can all be done on the papers. But sometimes it's easier for the Commissioner to have the parties there that can put questions and discuss the application of the agreement in practice. Interested parties can challenge the approval of agreements, and that's normally done through a hearing. That can be around, perhaps one union has looked at an agreement negotiated by another union in their industry and thought, well, actually it does undermine the standards for workers, that it is less than the Better Off Overall test. And this can happen too in organisations where there's multiple unions. Then there could be questions around the approval of agreements. And sometimes unions will intervene in a non-union agreement if it's come to their attention and they feel that there are problems with that agreement. They'll be able to intervene. Employer associations don't like that capacity that unions have to involve themselves in the agreement making process, the agreement approval process. Now, turning to regulating the bargaining process itself, as we've already explained, employers have an obligation to bargain in good faith if a majority of employees want a collective agreement. We have these things called bargaining representatives. Now, the union will be the employee's bargaining representative unless someone else has been appointed or the employees appointed themselves. If there is someone who's a union member who's going to be covered by the proposed agreement, by default the union is their representative. Employers are treated to be their own bargaining representative, but they can also appoint someone else, such as an employer association or a lawyer. Now, what if an employer refuses to bargain? They might feel that they're better off with just sticking with the award, or they might think that the majority of workers don't want an enterprise agreement. This can be tested. So a small group of employees who want the agreement or a union, they can approach the Commission and the Commission will make a majority support determination. There will usually be some kind of ballot undertaken. It's up to the Commission as to what process they use, but the Commission needs to find out that a majority of employees in the organisation actually want an enterprise agreement. Otherwise, there's no obligation on the employer to bargain. Now, if that majority support determination is made, then we go to the start of the process. The employer has to notify employees of their bargaining representative rights, etc., etc. Good faith bargaining obligations. This is a summary of those. To attend and participate in meetings, to share information, respond to proposals from one party to another, give genuine consideration to proposals, give reasons for responses, refrain from impulsive or unfair conduct, or conduct that undermines freedom of association. So if employees have said, yes, we want an enterprise agreement, and we want our union to represent us, the employer has no say. They've actually got to work with that. They've got to recognise the union for bargaining. Now, this good faith bargaining idea that the parties aren't compelled to reach an agreement. If bargaining's happened and you've exchanged information, there's been proposals given and responses, and perhaps the proposed agreement really looks unsustainable for that business, the employer can say no. And that means that it's not put to the ballot of employees and the existing industrial arrangements continue on, which is likely to be the award. During the bargaining process, protected industrial action is possible. It's very closely regulated by the Fair Work Commission. Now, industrial action, it could be total withdrawal of labour through something like a strike, or it might be something like a ban. Employers can engage in protected industrial action, that would be a lockout, but under the Fair Work Act, their capacity to take industrial action is really circumscribed by the Act. It'd be normal for employers to be able to lock out their workers during bargaining in most collective bargaining systems around the world, but in Australia they can only engage in a lockout if unions have taken industrial action first. If employees are engaged in industrial action or if they've been locked out, they don't get paid. Now, the union has to approach the Fair Work Commission initially to be approved to hold a secret ballot of their members. They don't talk to their members first, they've got to get permission from the Commission. And then, the unions will have their individual members vote on not just taking industrial action, but the kinds of industrial action that they agree should be possible. And once they've got approval from members, then again they've got to go back to the Commission to actually act on that approval and give notice of taking the industrial action. The Fair Work Commission won't allow this secret ballot to happen unless there's they're convinced that there'd been some genuine attempt to reach agreement. And employees can't be paid during industrial action, but also they can't be dismissed from their jobs, and they can't be disciplined or victimised by the employer. Industrial action's a normal part of bargaining. Now, bargaining orders. If things aren't going terribly well in bargaining, parties can approach the Commission for a bargaining order. This is slightly different from asking for the Commission's help. A bargaining order is a much more formal thing, and it can take anything from 6 to 8 weeks to have an order made. And it might be around the refusal to share some information, or from not having enough meetings scheduled, for example. Now, the idea of bargaining in good faith is not a new idea, but it is a new part of the Australian system. And there was a lot of interest when the Act was passed as to how the Commission would interpret the meaning of good faith. And some very early examples are relied on to get some sort of sense of what it means. So, two from the employer side, two from the union side. The Commonwealth Bank was seen not to bargain in good faith because whilst the finance sector union were, put a pay demand on the bank didn't respond. Instead, the bank gave workers a unilaterally determined pay increase, a pay increase they decided for themselves, and they didn't respond to the union. That seemed to be undermining workers' rights to be represented by a union during bargaining. The CPU, they not bargaining in good faith, they didn't attend some meetings. NCR Australia, an IT company, they unilaterally withdrew from bargaining, and the union felt it hadn't been, the bargaining hadn't been completed, and the employer kind of walked away. The Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, they was found to be in breach of good faith bargaining because they changed their minds about the scope of the agreement. Now, there's some details and rules around agreement content, what you must have and what you can't have. Some mandatory terms listed in the Fair Work Act, and these are quite sensible, practical things about maintaining the relationship and how bargaining is going to work. So you have to have an expiry date, can't be more than 4 years in the future. You have to have a dispute settlement procedure for managing the relationship. You have to have individual flexibility terms, and you have to have a consultation term or an organisational change term. So if work is going to be reorganised or changed in some way over the life of the agreement, the employer isn't prevented from doing that, but they're required to consult with workers, particularly if that major workplace change might result in redundancies. Agreements have to include a pay rate as well, and the base pay rate for each employee can't be less than that specified in an award. Now, if you've got an enterprise agreement with, say, pretty low rates of pay in it, there will have to be some provision for increases over the life of the agreement, or a commitment made by the employer that they will ensure that wages at least stay in step with award wages as varied each year through the annual wage review. Some unlawful terms, things you can't have, discriminatory terms, objectionable terms, terms that really are about contradicting the law of the land, or creating some disadvantages for particular groups of workers. That being said, the Fair Work Act has fewer restrictions on agreement content compared to, say, the work choices era. For example, there's fewer restrictions around union-employer relationships and arrangements. One thing that has been retained is this prohibition of bargaining fees. It's still illegal for a union to charge non-members for representing them in a union collective agreement. Now, the low-paid sector, this is interesting. To me, this idea that there's provisions in the Act that allow for multi-employer bargaining in low-paid sectors is a commitment. It shows the commitment to a bargaining system. Normally, community services, aged care, cleaning, etc., these are sectors of the economy where workers are award reliant. They get the award. And the Fair Work Act really wants to move away from awards. Awards are just to be the safety net. They really want to move to a bargaining system. But what do you do with those sectors of the economy where workers have really low bargaining power? So they've come up with the different means for engaging in bargaining, stronger role for the Commission, no industrial action. This hasn't taken off terribly well. There hasn't been a great deal of benefit to workers through the option of this low-paid bargaining sector. But yeah, interesting feature of the Act that really does show the Fair Work Act is about a bargaining system with some arbitration. We used to have an arbitration system with some bargaining, but now truly we have a bargaining system. Arbitration's just a minimal part of it. Some arbitration, as I said, it's a last resort. The parties are meant to bargain and manage their own relationships, but the Commission is there to help if it's necessary. Initially, that could be done through conciliation, and the Fair Work Commission can force the parties to attend conciliation where they can make their recommendations. Arbitration can happen if, say, that conciliation isn't going that well, or there's one or two final things that can't be resolved between the parties. Then the parties might agree to allow the Commission to make the determination for them. There are 3 circumstances where the Commission can arbitrate, really take the agreement making away from the parties and arbitrate themselves. But again, it is a last resort, and even once the Commissioner has made some orders, they will try and get the parties to resolve things. They might say, look, if you can't resolve it, we will arbitrate, but you've still got some time to resolve it yourself. Now, the most common circumstance where the Commission steps in to arbitrate is where they make an order to suspend industrial action. If it's decided that the industrial action is threatening public health or safety or damaging to the economy, then they can make this order that they'll arbitrate. The usual approach is that the parties will be told you've got 3 to 6 weeks to resolve things. If not, the Commission will make an industrial action related workplace determination. The Commission will impose an outcome on you. Second case is where bargaining is really broken down and one or more of the parties have been in serious breach of bargaining orders made by the Commission. That would be a serious breach declaration. And here, again, the Commission will say to the parties, look, we're seeing these problems here. You've got 6 weeks or we'll make the decision for you. It does not pay to annoy the Commission. If it does not pay to breach a bargaining order, things will only get worse. Now, and then the final one for the low-paid sector. There's no right to industrial action over a low-paid multi-employer proposed enterprise agreement. So, of course, you need some way of, resolving issues, and so that could be arbitration. Now, when the Commission does arbitrate, the Fair Work Act provides some guidelines. The Commission can only arbitrate on things that are still outstanding between the parties. They can't open everything up and start from scratch. When they make a decision, they look at the merits of the particular case in front of them. They consider the interests of the parties. They consider whether the parties, one or other, has acted in reasonable or unreasonable ways. And they give some consideration to a decision that would mean improved productivity at the business. And they give some consideration too to how the parties can build their relationship and do a better job of bargaining down the track. Now, there's been some annual reviews of tribunal decisions. This Fair Work Commission, are they really taking on board this idea that they're in the background, that they're there to facilitate bargaining? They're not there to arbitrate and to determine workplace matters. This first annual review, decisions in 2009, a lot of interest there because that was the start of the new legislation. It was concluded early on by examining tribunal decisions that commissioners felt fairly hamstrung by certain procedural aspects in the Act. They couldn't use their experience as industrial relations practitioners to solve problems and just get on with things, to have agreements approved quickly. They really did have to work through step by step the technicalities in the Act. And it's seen that the agreement making processes more procedurally driven rather than focusing on the interests of the parties. And really the Act is stopping the commissioners from using their discretion. For example, perhaps an enterprise agreement might look pretty good to a commissioner and they're thinking this, of course workers will be better off, but they can't approve it if, say, it was only available to workers for 6 days instead of 7 before they voted on it. They're not allowed to approve it, even if it's in the best interest of everybody. By contrast, when it comes to things about bargaining orders and protected industrial action, the Commission has been able to act the way it has in the past with lots of discretion to make sensible decisions in the best interests of the party and in the national interest. Now moving on, a couple of cases where, as the people got used to the legislation, it became clear that the Commission was searching for ways to minimise the procedural issues and make the system more practicable for the actors. And one thing that they started to see more and more was this use of undertakings. So rather than start a whole process from scratch, if you see a particular issue that's come up, get an undertaking from the employer as to how they're going to deal with that, or get an undertaking on the spot to improve a particular provision. That's a less hidebound way of dealing with things. And Katen, Saridi and Brown were really curious as to how the Commission would respond to the Fair Work Act. And they feel that the Commission really has accepted this new approach where arbitration's in the background, their role is in the background, and that they've really embraced this idea of helping bargaining along, helping to improve relationships. So rather than trying to assert their own authority and assert control, it's all about trying to improve the relationships and to improve the conduct of bargaining, improve industrial relations expertise at the parties. They're trying to do themselves out of a job, perhaps. There were a couple of good faith bargaining cases that were of interest. There was one case, Endeavour Coal, and J.J. Richards is the second one. These seem to set some precedents here. An employer was found to breach their good faith bargaining obligations if they just said no. So you can't just say, if employee reps are putting forward ideas, you can't just say no. You actually have to discuss and respond properly. With the J.J. Richards case, employer associations were very unhappy with this one. This case allowed a union to apply for a protected action ballot before bargaining had commenced. Now, for a union, that makes sense because it takes quite some time to go through, apply to the Commission for permission to have a ballot, you run the ballot, then you apply for the Commission to take industrial action. They wanted to get all that in train, even while bargaining was hardly underway. So for the unions, it's a way of perhaps putting pressure on the employer to conduct bargaining quickly. But of course, employer associations feel, it's sort of threatening the employer, and that's not a good approach to bargaining. So continued reviews, that there's still decisions that point to unhelpful technicalities in the legislation around agreement making. One emerging issue, not really a trend, I guess, but looking at the tactical opportunities in the Act, the same way that employers, unions might go for a protected action ballot to put pressure on the employer to make concessions to speed up bargaining. One thing that employers seem to do is consider the option of applying to terminate an existing enterprise agreement. So say bargaining has been quite protracted, or the demands from employees or unions seem to be too extreme in the employer's view. The employer can apply to have a current enterprise agreement cancelled before they've got the new one negotiated and approved. This means that workers will be significantly worse off, because in most cases rates of pay under an enterprise agreement are much higher than what they are under the award. And it's a real threat to hangover employees that you could lose your enterprise agreement rate of pay and end up on the award rate of pay. It's up to the Commission to decide whether they'll accept this application to terminate an agreement while bargaining is still continuing. That's it for our agreement making section.